Chapter 8: War, Revolution, and Depression. The Limits of Liberalism. The Impact of War. Protectionism, imperialism, and social reform led to a substantial growth in the administrative and military apparatus of the state, and were associated with the centralization and bureaucratization of state power, but they did not mark a fundamental break with the liberal form of the state. However, the priorities of war dictated that social production be brought under political control to secure its subordination to the war effort, while the need to secure the active collaboration of the working class in the imperialist war meant that the state had to be more responsive to working class economic, social, and political aspirations. However, the growing integration of the power of capital and the power of the state and the political advance of the working class threw into question both the class character and the liberal form of the state. The outbreak of war did not immediately lead to the development of new forms of economic regulation. The war was expected to be short, and the belief was that governments could secure the necessary manpower and military supplies by relying on the market, financing expenditures by the traditional wartime expedient of borrowing. However, while military expenditure absorbed the overproduction that was emerged in the later stages of the pre-war boom, it soon became clear that capital could not respond adequately to the signals of the price mechanism. Increased government demand led to shortages of supply and price increases, while military recruitment led to manpower shortages. Inflation and profiteering led to growing working class unrest, while labor shortages strengthened the hand of the trade unions. The wartime priority accorded to the development of the forces of production suspended the resistance of capital to the direct intervention of the state in the regulation of production in exchange for guaranteed profits. Direct controls were imposed on production, strategic industries were requisitioned, and wages and the allocation and use of labor brought under increasingly rigorous and comprehensive control. The end to increase production and to develop substitutes for scarce imports led to government intervention to rationalize production units, introduce new methods of production and new forms of work organization, and sponsor scientific and industrial research. Wartime expenditure was financed by government borrowing, but much of this borrowing was financed in turn by credit expansion that increased inflationary pressures, a further twist being added by increased levels of indirect taxation. Inflation was contained to a limited extent by increases in direct taxation and by price controls, but it was only when working class resistance to profiteering and the erosion of real wages threatened to get out of hand that systematic price controls, food rationing, and increases in taxation reduced inflationary pressures. The limited resources of the state meant that the apparatus of planning and control gave capitalists unprecedented opportunities to reverse the working class gains of the previous decades. However, the closer association between capital and the state undermined the claim of the state to be directing the war effort in the national interest. On the other hand, the need to secure the willing body of recruits and conscripts to provide an energetic labor force at home and cannon fodder for the front made it imperative that the working class be persuaded not merely to acquiesce passively in the war effort, but to identify itself with the war aims of the state. The war split the nominally internationalist European working class parties, the majority factions identifying more or less enthusiastically with the war effort. The trade union leadership was accommodated to the restrictions on trade union rights and the concession of hard-won advances by promises of regulated wages, secure employment, and a post-war restoration of the status quo. The collaboration of the working class leadership in the war effort was sealed by its admission to the corridors of power, the political leadership participating in government, the trade unions leadership being represented on consultative and administrative bodies in the hope that it would be able to secure its political advance permanently after the war, socialists seeing the apparatus of wartime control as a stage in the inevitable advance towards socialism. The participation of the working class leadership in government brought few immediate advantages to the rank and file. On the whole, the organized working class initially accepted the erosion of real wages as a contribution to the war effort. However, the contrast between low wage rates, compensated only by long hours of overtime, and widespread profiteering by employers, shopkeepers, and landlords led to growing resentment. The haphazard development of payment systems, restrictions on the mobility of labor, the abolition of trade union rights, and the extensive dilution of skilled labor eroded differentials, while the collaboration of the trade union leadership in government closed off the normal channels through which the affected workers could express their grievances. Growing resentment, particularly among skilled male workers, found its outlet in the development of rank-and-file organization that crossed union and plant boundaries and was strongly influenced by syndicalist ideas of direct action socialism and workers' control, finding its political expression in the socialist parties that had opposed the war. These tendencies were manifested to a greater or lesser degree in all the contending powers. In Britain, the Clyde rent strike of 1915 led to the Rent Restriction Act, while the Clyde Revolt of 1916 and the more widespread engineering strike of 1917 secured closer control of the price and supply of food, the institutionalization of national wage determination, with significant wage increases, concessions on dilution and labor mobility, the extension of unemployment insurance, the development of progressive taxation, including company taxation, and promises of a new Jerusalem to be built after the war. These measures served to diffuse rank-and-file protest until military successes rekindled patriotic enthusiasm and optimistic expectations of the new world to be built. In Russia, the autocratic state was less well placed to represent itself as the embodiment of the national spirit, and found itself increasingly isolated as the working class parties cemented alliance between rank-and-file workers, peasantry, and disaffected soldiers. The revolution of February 1917 that installed a liberal democratic government did nothing to eliminate military and administrative corruption, nor to halt the deterioration in the economic and military position, and was followed by the Bolshevik victory in the October Revolution. In Germany, the working class movement was sharply divided. Economic breakdown and military failure towards the end of the war strengthened the revolutionary movement. However, the Social Democratic Party saw the massive bureaucratization and nationalization of industry in the later stages of the war as the basis of a post-war regime of state socialism, and so was strongly committed to maintaining the authority of the state. Thus, the Social Democratic Party participated enthusiastically in the suppression of the German Revolution, so sealing the fate of the revolutionary uprisings in the rest of Central Europe. The post-war reconstruction of liberalism. The war had seen fundamental changes in the form of the state, involving the extensive socialization of production, a pervasive system of controls, and a strengthening of working-class political representation. The fundamental issue in the immediate post-war period was that of the form of the state, and of the relationship between the power of capital, the power of the state, and the power of the organized working class. Working class parties had entered a government in the expectation of participating in the construction of a, quote, new social order, as the 1918 Labor Party manifesto described it. Labor's program retained a commitment to free trade, the gold standard, and the balanced budget, but anticipated a considerable increase in the scope of government economic intervention. This program built on the work of the Ministry of Reconstruction that had drawn up elaborate plans to cope with the problems of the transition to peace, using the newly developed systems of control and administration to maintain a stable and growing peacetime economy. In Germany, the Social Democrats had even more ambitious plans to use their control of the state apparatus to build a regime of state socialism. On the left, on the other hand, revolutionary syndicalism and direct action socialism was given a stronger political dimension by the example of the Russian Revolution and sought to achieve socialism not through the state, but through the development of revolutionary industrial unionism and shop floor organization. The revolutionary left anticipated the replacement of the capitalist state by a corporate form of democratic administration built on workers' councils or guilds representing consumers and producers. The bourgeoisie, on the other hand, saw the war as no more than a brief interruption of its triumphal progress, the cause of the war lying not in the contradictions of capital accumulation, but in the militarism and intransigence of the European autocracies. While the interventionist apparatus, which was the basis of socialist ambitions, was seen as a wartime expedient whose retention in peacetime risked a resurgence of nationalism, militarism, and revolution. The primary aim of the bourgeoisie was to reconstruct the pre-war world, restoring the liberal state The primary aim of the bourgeoisie was to reconstruct a pre-war world, restoring the liberal state form with a liberal world order based on free trade and the gold standard. However, the first priority was to check the aspirations of the working class. The context within which the struggle was fought out was that of a world restocking boom that unleashed the pent-up inflation of the wartime years before its collapse in 1921 was followed by severe recession. In Germany, the social democratic government faced an insuperable financial problem. The government was unable to introduce significant increases in taxation for fear of alienating its working class supporters, or to renounce interest payments on the massive wartime debt, the fear of alienating the middle class on a portion of whose votes it had come to depend, while it faced the heavy cost of welfare expenditure and food subsidies to quell the working class unrest, in addition to the costs of economic reconstruction and reparations payments. The result was a soaring budget deficit that could only be financed by monetary expansion, stimulating hyperinflation and an eventual relapse into barter. The effect of inflation was to reduce real wages, only partially compensated by food handouts and welfare benefits, and to devalue debts, dispossessing the frugal and patriotic middle class at the expense of speculators, farmers, and big industrial capital, discrediting the social democratic government in the eyes of its middle and working class supporters, who turned to the more radical parties of the left and right. The grandiose dream of social democracy collapsed as the government found itself presiding over a massive concentration of wealth in the hands of capital, relying on the military to preserve the authority of the state by suppressing working class resistance and the Nazi putsch, preparing the way for political, economic, and financial reconstruction on the basis not of the power of the working class, but that of capital. In Britain, the legacy of the war was a contradictory legacy. The state had made considerable progress in the domestication of industrial and political organizations of the working class. The bulk of the labor leadership had participated enthusiastically in the war, and the party had committed itself to constitutional politics. Trade union leaders had collaborated in the development of a system of negotiation and arbitration, and of national agreements which established a stable industrial relations framework, in which the unions played the ambivalent role of representing their members' interest in negotiations, but subsequently imposing an agreed settlement on any recalcitrant elements of their own membership. On the other hand, the increased power and status of the trade unions saw a massive increase in trade union membership over the war years, while the collaborative zeal of some of the leadership stimulated the growth of an increasingly militant and organized shop stewards movement. These developments were reflected politically in the closer attachment of the trade union leadership to pursuing their political ends through the Labour Party, and was reconstituted in 1918, on the one hand, and in the further growth of direct action socialism, with its roots in the shop stewards movement on the other. The fear of the state was not an organized working class as such, for it had played a major role in legitimating that organization, but of a working class that challenged the power of the state by pursuing its political aims outside the Constitution on the basis of its own collective strength. Thus, the problem was not simply that of the increased strength and assertiveness of the organized working class, but was more fundamentally that of the political forms of working class struggle in the form of the state. The political task was a familiar one: to secure the radical separation of trade union from political activity, ensuring that the mobilization of the collective strength of the working class was confined to the pursuit of sectional industrial interests, while workers pursued their democratic aspirations as citizens through the constitutional channel of the ballot box. The development of the machinery of industrial relations and the 1918 extension of the franchise provided a constitutional framework within which the working class could pursue its legitimate trade union and political aims. The political problem was that of confining working class aspirations within the framework. The direct intervention of the state in production meant that industrial struggles against the employers immediately developed into political struggles against the state, and to demands that state power should be used to bring social production under democratic control. The political stabilization of the state, therefore, depended not simply on the defeat of the militant sections of the working class, but also on restructuring class relations on the basis of the separation of civil society and the state, the restoration of the rule of money in the market, and the reconstitution of the liberal state form. The growing militancy of the rank-and-file movement in the strategic industries had led the government to make considerable concessions in the later stages of the war. The end of the war brought new political dangers as troops returned from the front and workers and employers confronted one another as each sought to build on their wartime gains. The immediate fear was of wage cutting as demobilized troops flooded the labor market, and this fear lay behind the government's reluctance to curb the inflationary boom. In late 1918, legislation was introduced prohibiting wage cuts for a period of 6 months and established further trade boards, joint industrial councils, and a council court. 1919 saw a wave of, quote, political strikes involving the miners, the railway workers, and even the police, directed as much at the government as at the employers. The immediate response of the government was contradictory. Although a further miners' strike in 1920 was accompanied by intensive military preparations on the part of the government and the introduction of the draconian Emergency Powers Act, which was brought into play in the 1921 lockout and the 1926 general strike. A conciliatory approach to the trade unions was accompanied by plans for the extension of the Edwardian social reforms. Unemployment insurance was made almost universal, and non-contributory benefits. Unemployment insurance was made almost universal, and contributory benefits were made available to keep those who had exhausted their entitlement out of the clutches of the poor law. Old age pensions were doubled, and substantial subsidies offered to local authorities to expand education and housing. The ending of the boom, with a rapid rise in unemployment and a collapse in prices, fundamentally altered the balance of power. The rapid dismantling of wartime controls over production, wages, and the allocation of labor freed the employers, particularly in engineering, to move on to the offensive and to abrogate wartime agreements. However, the sharpest political confrontations were threatened in the mines and on the railways, which were still effectively in public ownership. The obvious solution to the structural problems of these industries, which are both plagued by inadequate investment, excess capacity, and too many small and fiercely competitive enterprises, was nationalization. And this was both the demand of the working class and, in the case of the mines, the recommendation of the Sankey Commission of 1919. The alternative proposed by the owners was to return the industries to private ownership with generous subsidies and preferably monopoly powers. There is nothing inherently socialist in the proposal for nationalization. Public ownership had long been established as the form through which the state limited the ability of particular capitals to exploit monopoly powers. It was a remedy that had already been well tested as a means of restructuring capital and rationalizing supply in the bus and tram, gas, water, and electricity industries, where the duplication of facilities as a result of competition had led to chronic excess capacity, and abroad, the public ownership of mines and railways was common. Despite the imminent political and economic rationality of public ownership, the government returned the mines and railways to their former owners, reorganizing the railways in the Act of 1921 that gave the owners monopoly powers with a guaranteed rate of return on their capital, while institutionalizing collective bargaining and establishing a national wages board. The reason for this move was not simply the resistance of employers to the encroachment of the state, but more the anticipation on the part of the government of the fierce class struggles that the attempt to force down wages and rationalize production was bound to unleash, struggles that would inevitably be politicized if the government was directly involved as one party to the dispute. The restoration of the mines and railways to private ownership was therefore essential if the state was to restructure class relations and confine the class struggle within the constitutional limits of the liberal state form. The restoration of private ownership in the mines was immediately followed by a bitter strike in which the miners were soundly defeated. The defeat of the engineers in 1922 completed the rout of the most militant sections of the working class, the passing of the political threat, and the need to make economies achieve a balanced budget also led to substantial cuts in the program of social reform, particularly in the areas most costly to the exchequer of education and housing, although the housing cuts were soon reversed amid a deepening housing crisis. With the fall of the minority 1924 Labor government, the stage was set for the final defeat of the rank-and-file movement, the opportunity for which was provided by the struggle in the mines as the employers responded to the 1925 slump by seeking further wage cuts and an extension of the working day. The government stalled for time while it built up its defenses, and then drew the TUC into the general strike of 1926, presenting the trade union leadership with the stark alternative of putting itself at the head of a revolutionary movement whose mass base had already been undermined, or committing itself to the constitutional path. There's a footnote. It's not directly connected to the last thing. I just realized there was a footnote. It was an awareness of this contradiction that later underlay the persistent ambivalence of the Labor Party and trade union leadership over the issue of nationalization that was supposedly the linchpin of their socialism. The contradiction was resolved later in the 1920s with the adoption of the public corporation as the appropriate institutional form for the nationalized industry, a form to which the Labor Party became firmly attached, and in the continuation of the practice pioneered in wartime of including trade unionists on the various commissions, committees, boards, and councils that played a part in the formation and implementation of industrial policies. End of footnote. The collapse of the general strike sealed a victory that had already been won by the failure of direct action socialism to extend far beyond its industrial base in the rank-and-file movement, a base that had already been shattered in the strikes of 1921 to 22, and by the disengagement of the state from direct intervention in production, which had largely deprived syndicalism of its political significance. It finally destroyed the hopes of the direct action socialists that the working class would achieve workers' control simply on the basis of workers' power, and confirmed the trade union leadership in the futility of using political pressure to secure trade union demands. The syndicalists were absorbed into the labor and communist parties, while the trade union leadership sought to distance itself from politics. The 1927 trade disputes and the Trade Union Act was primarily directed at the political role of the trade unions and at the extension of strike activity beyond the immediate employer. reinforcing the tendency for local negotiation to replace national bargaining, and for politics to be confined to constitutional channels, through the Labor Party and representations to government. Although the trade unions used their political weight inside the Labor Party, they were wary of forging too close a link with the Labor Party, since they hoped to negotiate with whichever government happened to be in power. Thus, the trade unions sought to establish a direct relationship with the state bureaucracy, a relationship the state was willing to accept so long as it was on a consultative basis and did not imply the trade unions using their collective strength to secure political ends. While continued depression and the defeat of the general strike reduced the strength of the trade unions in the staple industries, the growth of new industries producing for the home market provided a basis for a more conciliatory approach to industrial relations, the trade unions developing a positive enthusiasm for cooperation with the employers in, quote, rationalization schemes. That involved increasing investment to secure the stability and security of income and employment. Although the employers in the new industries did not share the union's enthusiasm for cooperation, they did favor stable industrial relations to maintain the continuity of production, which was particularly important if they were to cover their high fixed costs. The union in the staple industries meanwhile looked to the government for solutions to the problems of overcapacity and persistent unemployment. Although minority labor governments took power in 1924 and 1929, and some labor local authorities pursued energetic programs to expand public education and housing and to ameliorate the harshness of the poor law, the high point of working class advance was already reached in 1921. Despite the growth of trade unionism and the extension of the franchise, the working class remained the object and not the subject of state power. While working class militancy was seen as a serious political threat, significant social reforms could be wrested from the state, but once the constitutional threat had passed, the government's enthusiasm for reform waned. The day-to-day struggle of workers to exist brought them into conflict with employers, landlords, and the state, but the reconstitution of the liberal state form, the defeat of direct action socialism, and the retreat of the Labor Party and the TUC in the wake of the general strike meant that the struggles emerging from such everyday conflicts tended to be isolated and fragmented. The working class had been very effectively brought back within the limits of the liberal state form. The reconstruction of the liberal world order. The wartime apparatus of intervention was not only politically objectionable to the bourgeoisie, but was also inappropriate to the economic problems raised by post-war Reconstruction. The wartime apparatus had been directed at the maximization of production and its subordination to the war effort, the valorization of capital being guaranteed by the state. This apparatus remained appropriate in the immediate post-war boom, when the explosion of pent-up demand offered apparently unlimited opportunities. But with the collapse of the boom, on top of the sharp contraction of government contracts, capital was left to its own devices. The barrier to accumulation was no longer limited productive capacity and the limited supply of labor, but the limited market that appeared primarily in the form of overproduction in the staple industries. The foundation of this barrier was the overaccumulation of capital on a world scale that was a legacy of the pre-war boom. The war had reinforced overaccumulation in the basic industries, and had also reinforced the uneven sectoral and geographical development of the forces of production on a world scale. The demands of war and the immediate post-war restocking boom had concealed the excess capacity, but overproduction on a world scale soon brought the boom to a shuddering halt. The problem appeared not to be one of overproduction so much as of limited access to world markets. The revival of international trade was restricted by the suspension of the institutions of international money and credit that made it possible to overcome the barrier of the market by reconciling sustained accumulation with payments imbalances and by the proliferation of protective tariffs. Against the demand of the working class to bring capital under democratic control, the immediate priority of the bourgeoisie was the reconstruction of the international monetary system based on the gold standard and the liberalization of trade. The restoration of the gold standard had a political as well as an economic rationale. On the one hand, the gold standard was seen as the key to the reconstruction of the international political system, checking economic nationalization by subordinating the nation state to the supranational authority of gold. Thus, the reconstruction of the gold standard was one of the first tasks undertaken under the aegis of the new League of Nations. On the other hand, the gold standard was seen as the key to domestic political stability in providing the only check in the temptation of governments to respond to popular pressure by resorting to the inflationary financing of social expenditure. Keynes, the foremost critic of the gold standard, expressed a common view in regarding inflation and price instability as the greatest threats to the survival of capitalism. Not only does inflation undermine rational capitalist calculation and generate cyclical fluctuations, but inflation also breeds popular unrest, as shown most menacingly in Russia and Germany. As Keynes noted, quote, "To convert the businessman into the profiteer is to strike a blow at capitalism, because converting the businessman into the profiteer destroys the psychological equilibrium which permits the perpetuance of unequal rewards. The economic doctrine of normal profits, vaguely apprehended by everyone, is a necessary condition for the justification of capitalism." End quote. Keynes. Footnote. No footnote. The crucial issue for Keynes was whether the gold standard would achieve such stability. Keynes was one of the first economists to wake up to the fact that the gold standard did not work through the specie flow mechanism, but was rather a system of managed currencies, although he believed that this was a relatively recent development. Keynes' objection to the restoration of the gold standard was based on his fear that the enormous gold reserves of the United States would give free rein to domestic inflationism, which would then be communicated throughout the world because of the financial powers of the U.S. For Keynes, both political and economic considerations dictated a monetary policy that was directed at domestic price stability rather than the stability of the exchange rate. Although most economists and bankers felt that exchange rate stability was the essential foundation of a stable international monetary system, Keynes was by no means alone in recognizing the superiority in principle of a managed currency. Nevertheless, in practice, Keynes' proposals were regarded as politically naive, for the removal of the discipline of the gold standard merely extended the inflationary latitude enjoyed by U.S. politicians to all governments. Inflationism, therefore, should be combated within the gold standard regime by agreement between central banks. The flexibility of exchange rates carried the additional threat of governments using currency manipulation as a nationalistic weapon, as they had used tariffs before the war, leading to competitive devaluations and persistent economic and political instability. Underlying the conflict between the two positions was the familiar contradiction that the capitalist state had to resolve of reconciling domestic economic and political stability with the accumulation of capital on a world scale. Faced with the choice, Keynes opted for the former. However, Keynes was almost alone in the early 1920s in believing that there was a conflict between the two objectives. Thus, there was almost universal agreement that a return to gold was the essential foundation of both accumulation on a world scale and domestic order and prosperity. The reconstruction of the gold standard was no simple task, for it implied the subordination of the nation-state once more to the power of world money, while the parity at which gold was restored defined the terms on which domestic capitals were integrated into the accumulation of capital on a world scale. Thus, the reconstruction of the gold standard could only be achieved through a coordinated international effort, and preferably one that was conducted by central bankers, with as little reference to politicians who would be subject to narrow nationalistic pressures as possible. The leading role in this task of reconstruction was played by Montagu Norman, governor of the Bank of England, in close collaboration with Benjamin Strong, head of the New York Federal Reserve Bank. Although Norman and Strong certainly sought to strengthen the position of London and New York as international financial centers, and so arouse the antagonism of Paris, there was no alternative to rebuilding the gold standard around the London-New York axis, based on an alliance between the financial strength of New York and the expertise and institutional strength of London. The war had seen a transformation in the trading and financial position of the United States, with New York emerging as the world's strongest financial center. However, New York was not in a position to take over London's role as center of the international financial system. On the one hand, the New York banking system simply had not developed the institutions and wealth of experience in handling complex international transactions that London had built up over a century. On the other hand, the U.S. economy was far less dependent on world markets than was the British, while strong populist currents continued to resist the exercise of the power of the banks. Thus, there was a potential conflict between the international responsibilities of New York in the regulation of the financial system and the vulnerability of the banks to political and economic pressure to regulate the financial system in accordance with domestic political objectives. Britain had been able to resolve the dilemma before the war because its commercial and financial strength and the sophistication of Britain's financial institutions enabled the Bank of England to pursue domestic and international financial policies more or less independently of one another. Although Britain's commercial and financial position had been weakened by the war, the underlying weaknesses were not immediately apparent. While it had lost many of its traditional markets to domestic producers or foreign competitors, the balance of payments had been maintained by an improvement in the terms of trade and the virtual cessation of long-term foreign investment, while buoyant exports in the immediate post-war boom held out some prospects of revival. While it had to borrow heavily from the U.S. to protect its reserves in the latter stages of the war, these liabilities were more or less matched by the substantial loans Britain had extended to its allies. While Britain's gold reserves were only a quarter the size of the Americans', Britain's gold reserves were very respectable by historical standards. Thus, Britain seemed as well equipped to manage the gold standard as Britain had been before the war, provided that Britain could secure a degree of cooperation from the U.S. authorities, particularly in making U.S. gold available in case sterling came under pressure. Moreover, the City of London was reluctant to abandon its leading role, which brought substantial profits to London bankers, shippers, and insurers, and considerable invisible earnings to cover the deficit on British trade. The first task facing the European governments' attempt to restore the gold standard was to bring domestic inflation under control in order to establish stable price levels against which to fix the parity of the participating currencies. The immediate problem was the enormous burden of war debt, the servicing and repayment of which imposed considerable pressure on state finances. This created a problem for monetary control because of the forms of financing that had been adopted during the war, which had inflated domestic price levels and left an enormous overhang of liquidity. Governments could only bring inflation under control if governments could reduce their budget deficits and mop up the excess liquidity. However, such policies implied increases in taxation, cuts in public expenditure, and a tight monetary policy, the deflationary impact of which could only fuel the sharp class struggles of the immediate post-war period. The inflation was allowed to persist through the immediate post-war boom, and the reconstruction of the gold standard postponed until the balance of class forces had shifted decisively in the favor of capital. Norman and Strong played the leading role in the stabilization of the European currencies, often working through the new League of Nations, which channeled stabilization funds, much of which was provided. Norman and Strong played the leading role in the stabilization of the European currencies, often working through the new League of Nations, which channeled stabilization funds, much of which were provided by private banks. The most dramatic success was in Germany, where hyperinflation had destroyed the currency, but laid the foundation for a solution by devaluing the government's debt. The stabilization of the currency in 1923 was followed by the Dawes Plan, that provided a large U.S. loan to meet the immediate difficulties that rescheduled reparations payments. The restoration of stability provided the basis for the return to gold in 1924 and stimulated a dramatic German recovery, which attracted a large inflow of U.S. capital to cover the subsequent flow of reparations payments. France presented greater difficulties. The government had expected its problems to be solved by German reparations, and so continued to run a larger budget deficit. While inflation was accommodated by the effective devaluation of the franc. However, British and American speculation against the franc, and then the Dawes Plan, undermined this strategy, and justifiably aroused French suspicions that Britain was trying to rebuild Germany as a counterweight to France. Thus, France rejected Norman's overtures and demanded an undervalued franc to build up its reserves so as to establish its independence, strengthening the competitiveness of French exporters into the bargain. The undervalued franc was established from 1926, although France did not officially return to the gold standard until 1928. In the meantime, France's attempt to go its own way was an important factor in the weakening of the gold standard. In Britain, there was little support for the Labour Party's proposal to deal with the problem of financial stabilization by means of a capital levy to reduce the government debt, even though debt service and repayment meant heavy increases in taxation to produce the required budget surplus. There was also very little support for Keynes' proposal of devaluation to accommodate the wartime inflation. But devaluation and a capital levy were regarded as morally and politically unacceptable, a violation of the rights of property, and a renunciation of the government's contractual obligations, which would set a precedent that was inconsistent with London's international financial role. The return to gold closely followed the pattern of events of the return to convertibility a century earlier, although the issue this time was far less contentious. The price to be paid for a return to free convertibility at the existing parity was recognized to be a bout of deflation, to bring the British price level back into line with that of the U.S. However, the political consequences of a sharp deflation at the end of the war were unacceptable, so the government formally went off gold in 1919 to buy the time in which to restore domestic monetary control by mopping up the surplus liquidity in the banking system. The deflationary impact of its budget surplus and tight monetary policy was just beginning to bite when the boom broke, so that the restoration of convertibility was postponed, pending the stabilization of other European currencies, in the hope that U.S. inflation would remove the need to apply the last deflationary twist. In the event, speculation against the return to convertibility pushed up the pound so that restoration in 1925 went remarkably smoothly, although the overvalued pound added to the difficulties of the staple industries and promoted speculation against sterling. The overvalued pound kept down the price. Although the overvalued pound added to the difficulties of the staple industries and prompted speculation against sterling, the overvalued pound kept down the cost of imported food and raw materials and so boosted the newer industries, producing primarily for the domestic market in the hesitant recovery. The first year of the restored gold standard gave no indication of what was to come. The Bank of England was able to manage the gold standard and defend the reserves with very few changes in bank rate, relying on the gold devices, foreign exchange operations, and cooperation among central banks, so insulating the domestic economy from its international operations, although it did have to maintain relatively high interest rates. The League of Nations sponsored attempts to break down the high tariffs and import controls that had been imposed in the war and immediate post-war period, which checked the growth of protectionism. World trade expanded rapidly, and Europe played the leading role in the world boom from 1925. It appeared that the restoration of the liberal regime was bearing more fruit than its most optimistic adherents could have dreamed of a few years before. Yet liberal self-confidence was about to be shattered. The problem of staple industries. Although the restoration of financial stability and the growth of world trade pulled the British economy out of the post-war slump, Britain did not participate fully in the world boom of the late 1920s. The main problem was that of the staple industries, in which global overproduction was most marked, and in which British productivity lagged behind that of its competitors. The depression in the staple industries was at first generally believed to be merely a cyclical phenomenon, the normal purgative reaction to the inflationary post-war boom. However, the growth of world trade, as the European economies recovered from war and their currencies were stabilized, did not lead to a reopening of markets for the staple industries, but an intensification of competition as the capacity that had been expanded during the war and the post-war reconstruction boom sought outlets on the world market. Coal faced competition from more efficient European producers, which intensified sharply in 1925. Iron and steel continued to face protective tariffs in foreign markets and increased competition at home. Shipbuilding was faced by enormous overcapacity at home and competition from abroad. Textiles were progressively squeezed between the more efficient producers of the advanced countries and the low-wage producers of the periphery. The employers saw the problem as one of high interest rates and high wages at home, an overvalued pound and protective tariffs abroad. However, the employers did not favor devaluation to relieve the financial pressure, because the employers feared that devaluation would increase wage and raw material costs and inhibit the flow of foreign investment that was expected to stimulate exports. Thus, they saw wage cuts as the key to increased competitiveness and were increasingly attracted to protection and imperialism, summed up in the movement for the, quote, empire free trade, as the means of expanding markets. However, these panaceas evaded the fundamental problem, which is that of the low productivity that was the result of low investment, outdated production methods, a fragmented industrial structure, and incompetent management. Concern about the impact of foreign competition lay behind the, quote, rationalization movement that gathered momentum from 1924. Rationalization, following the German example, involved the concentration and centralization of capital to facilitate the achievement of continuous and integrated production, the application of modern scientific and managerial principles, and monopolistic control of markets, in order to plan capacity as much as to control prices. The rationalization movement progressed rapidly in the new industries, which built on wartime advances by adopting more sophisticated methods of production, including the assembly line and continuous process production, within large corporations, which protected their markets through monopolies and cartels. However, the fragmented ownership of capital in the staple industries, which were marked by severe competition, meant that the institutional and financial basis for expensive rationalization programs was lacking. Mergers and amalgamations in the staple industries were primarily defensive and limited in scope, involving financial integration but little managerial or technical rationalization. Trade associations restricted themselves to price fixing, and many collapsed in the slump of 1920 to 21. The banks had only limited and fragmented exposure to industry, and so had little interest in sponsoring rationalization, protecting their investments by nursing unprofitable enterprises along. Thus, the limited rationalization of the staple industries, far from stimulating productivity increases and the elimination of excess capacity, merely served to make the problem worse by sustaining excess capacity and supporting unprofitable enterprises. The obvious alternative was for the state to take the initiative in sponsoring more radical rationalization. The Labor Party had long endorsed monopolization under public control as an inevitable stage on the way to nationalization. Opinion in the Conservative Party moved in favor of monopolization as an alternative to nationalization, as it became clear that competitive pressure was not leading to rationalization and the elimination of uncompetitive producers. As the Balfour Committee noted in 1929, quote, "There can be no doubt that the operation of free competition is a very slow and costly method of eliminating excess capacity. The tendency of business working at a loss is sometimes extraordinary." As the Balfour Committee noted in 1929, quote, "There can be no doubt that the operation of free competition is a very slow and costly method of eliminating excess capacity. The tenacity of business working at a loss is sometimes extraordinary," end quote. Although the Liberals were slower to abandon their faith in the market, by the end of the decade, the Liberals recognized the inefficiency of competition. The Liberal Industrial Inquiry of 1929 even proposed that incorporated trade associations should have the legal power to enforce their rules throughout the appropriate trade or industry. Despite the growing strength of interventionist opinion in all political parties, effective measures were constantly resisted by the owners, who continued to hang on in the hope that the growth of world markets, or the introduction of, quote, "empire-free trade," end quote, would prove their salvation. The government was equally reluctant to take the initiative. This inactivity was not simply the result of ignorance or bloody-mindedness. On the one hand, the government was reluctant to intervene for fear of setting precedents that would lead capitalists to outbid each other in their pleas for support. For this reason, every effort was made to keep industrial policy out of the hands of Parliament. On the other hand, the restructuring of the staple industries could only be solved by the massive destruction of outdated capacity, heavy investment in the most modern methods of production, and the sacking of large numbers of workers in a context of high regional unemployment. The unemployed themselves did not constitute a serious political threat, but the process of restructuring would inevitably lead to a renewal of the struggles of the early 1920s. The government and employers were equally concerned to avoid such a prospect, and so allowed the staple industries to stagnate. Meanwhile, the unemployed were accommodated by the increasingly liberal dispensation of relief. However, the crash of 1929 and the ensuing World Depression brought the issues to a head once more. The 1929 crash and the collapse of the gold standard. The 1929 crash and the collapse of the gold standard. The Depression of the 1930s was inaugurated by the stock exchange crash in New York in 1929. The financial crisis had its roots in the overaccumulation of U.S. capital over the previous decade, accumulation was sustained by low interest rates and easy credit, even as the stock market boom assumed an increasingly speculative dimension. As the boom gathered momentum, the Federal Reserve banks lost control of the market altogether, and money poured into New York to feed the boom. The boom persisted through 1929, despite the piling up of unsold stocks, particularly in the new automobile and consumer durable industries, the cutting back of production, and the rise in unemployment. The inevitable collapse of the bubble precipitated widespread bankruptcies that turned a recession into severe depression. The gold standard survived the 1929 crash. However, the subsequent depression revealed the fragility of its foundations. The post-war gold standard was much more vulnerable than the post-war gold standard's predecessor. The internationalization of money capital meant that there was far more short-term capital flowing around the system in search of speculative gains. Competition between London and Paris undermined attempts to pursue a coordinated interest rate policy, and the higher degree of integration of domestic and international financial markets made the domestic economy more sensitive to interest rate changes, so that international monetary policies were constrained by domestic considerations, while high unemployment and the cost of debt service made the British government reluctant to allow interest rates to rise to strengthen the pound. The French government was reluctant to allow interest rates to fall, in the French government's determination to maintain a strong franc. Strong kept down New York rates to relieve the pressure on London, feeding the speculative boom, until the death of Strong and then the crash. Domestic considerations dictated high U.S. interest rates in the attempt to stabilize the domestic banking system and strengthen the dollar. Britain was the weak link in the system, holding only small reserves of gold against which to set a large volume of net short-term foreign debt and foreign holdings of sterling, the position being covered only by long-term foreign assets, many of which were of dubious status. Although France and the United States held large reserves, France and the United States were reluctant to free their reserves for fear of undermining their currencies. Thus, the system suffered from an acute shortage of liquidity in relation to the demands being made of it. The crash undermined confidence in the stability of the gold standard, weakening the ability of domestic currencies to serve as substitutes for world money in its function as a store of value, and so leading to a sharp contradiction. The crash undermined confidence in the stability of the gold standard, weakening the ability of domestic currencies to serve as substitutes for world money in world money's function as store of value, and so leading to a sharp contraction in liquidity, intensified by gold hoarding on the part of France and the United States. The weakening of confidence further increased speculative movements of, quote, hot money. The collapse of long-term foreign investment undermined the balance of payments of the capital importers, and the collapse of exports to the U.S. undermined that of the primary exporters. The shortage of liquidity forced a contraction of world trade in response to the U.S. depression, as governments reacted to payments imbalances by imposing deflationary policies and protective tariffs to defend their reserves. Primary producers were especially hard hit, as the decline in U.S. imports sent primary product prices that had already been weakening as overproduction emerged before the crash, spiraling downwards. The pressure was then transmitted to London as primary producers drew on their sterling balances and reduced the primary producers' imports from Britain. The pressure on the international financial system was further intensified by the new isolationism of the U.S. Federal Reserve System, compounded by the U.S. Federal Reserve System's inability to perform the domestic central banking role of lender of last resort, which led the U.S. Federal Reserve System repeatedly to tighten credit, and so to turn panics into banking crises. By 1931, the British balance of payments had moved into deficit. The Empire countries had run down their sterling deposits, and London faced a steady drain in Paris and Berlin, the reserves only being defended at the expense of high interest rates. A renewed financial crisis in Central Europe had led to heavy calls on London for accommodation and precipitated a crisis in confidence and flight of hot money that could only be countered without suspending convertibility by punitive interest rates or by raising loans abroad. Meanwhile, the rising cost of unemployment relief and falling revenues as insurance contributions fell threatened a budget deficit. The May Committee's report finally shattered the confidence of domestic and international financial markets by forecasting a substantial budget deficit and proposing widespread cuts in public expenditure, and particularly in unemployment benefit. It was made clear to the Labour government that foreign loans would only be forthcoming if the May report's proposals were adopted. The Labour government split, the bulk of the leadership joining the Conservatives in implementing the cuts, but a renewed drain finally forced Britain off gold, allowing the Bank of England to stabilize an undervalued pound and accumulate reserves. The speculation that forced Britain off gold delivered the death blow to the gold standard. 32 countries followed Britain off gold in 1932, anxious not to suffer a competitive disadvantage in the face of British devaluation. The British withdrawal from the gold standard focused speculative attention on the next link in the chain, the United States. The United States initially responded to speculative pressure with monetary contraction. However, monetary stringency forced the government to reverse an expansionary fiscal policy, which halted the U.S. recovery in its tracks, provoking renewed populist agitation against the bankers. In a last-ditch attempt to stabilize the system, a World Economic Conference was called in London in 1933. However, the United States devalued the dollar on the eve of the conference and refused to commit itself to the stabilization of the dollar for fear of the domestic political consequences. Britain, now free from deflationary pressure, and with the position of the City of London preserved as the center of a network of lesser currencies tied to sterling, similarly refused to resume the City of London's global role. Similarly refused to assume Britain's global role, and firmly resisted proposals for a cooperative solution based on the coordinated reflation of the leading national economies for fear of its inflationary consequences. The result was that France was left at the head of a gold bloc with Belgium, Switzerland, and the Netherlands, which sustained the gold standard until the gold standard finally collapsed in 1936. The failure of the World Economic Conference did not lead to the collapse of the world economy. The failure of the conference was in part due to the success that had already been achieved in securing international cooperation on a more limited basis, as bilateral and multilateral agreements led to the formation of currency blocs and preferential tariff treatment between trading partners, centered on the dominant powers. In the case of Britain, the substantial devaluation of 1931 relieved the immediate speculative pressures and enabled the Bank of England to build up large gold and foreign currency reserves with which to defend the exchange rate of the currency. This freed domestic monetary policy from immediate international constraints and allowed a substantial fall in interest rates, which limited the inflow of speculative funds. However, the stabilization of the currency in the longer term depended on strengthening the balance of international payments so that devaluation was immediately followed by the imposition of protective tariffs and the strengthening of controls on foreign lending. The danger of a tariff war with the countries of the empire was averted by the introduction of the system of imperial preference, to which further countries were added through bilateral agreements. Financial stability within this framework of limited multilateral trade was strengthened by tying the currencies of the countries of the, quote, sterling area directly to the pound. Similar arrangements led to the formation of the dollar area, covering the Americas, Central and Southeast European exchange control area dominated by Germany, the yen year in the Far East, and the gold bloc in Western Europe. International capital flows, apart from capital flight, were largely confined within these currency blocks, within which some progress was made in reciprocal trade liberalization. Finally, some stability in the international monetary system was reestablished, following the devaluation of the dollar and subsequent pressure on the franc, by the tripartite agreement by which the French, British, and U.S. authorities agreed to intervene to maintain fixed exchange rates between the three major currency areas. Thus, some degree of multilateral trade and finance was salvaged from the maelstrom. Money and credit in the crisis of overaccumulation. At first sight, the crisis and ensuing depression appeared to be a monetary phenomenon. A classic example of the pursuit of unsound banking practices, as the Federal Reserve had stimulated a massive speculative boom through overexpansionary monetary policies, which forced the authorities to adopt severely restrictive policies in the ensuing crash. However, we have seen that the tendency to overaccumulation is not the result of unsound banking practices, but is inherent in the form of capitalist accumulation. The boom of the 1920s was dominated by the development of the new consumer durables sector in the United States. The growth of this sector had been made possible by 19th century technological developments, but the market was initially very limited. However, the bureaucratization of both government and capitalist enterprise associated with the development of public and private monopolies and the growing administrative functions of the state was creating a growing middle class, the upper echelons of which enjoyed comfortable incomes. The same tendencies to monopolization created the large-scale enterprise that was able to reduce the cost of production by reaping the economies of standardization and mass production. Although the middle-class market was by no means a mass market, the sheer size of the United States made the market large enough to permit the development of these new branches of production. On the basis of the buoyant home market, U.S. manufacturers were able to export to European markets that were individually too small to sustain such industries. The growing export surplus of the United States provided the means for U.S. capital to move abroad in search of profitable outlets, the inflow of U.S. investment being the driving force underlying the European boom of the second half of the decade, in which the foundations of the new industries were laid in Europe alongside the established branches of production that flourished, except in Britain, in the boom. However, the basis of this boom was narrow, for the market for the new consumer products remained limited almost entirely to the middle class. The new industries, crying out for labor, paid relatively good wages, piece rates, and bonus schemes, designed to maintain the continuity and increase the pace of production, enabled some to boost their wages further. But although many industrial workers earned high enough wages to afford more diversified food, clothing, and adequate housing, and to buy simple manufactures such as bicycles and sewing machines, few could afford the more expensive cars and consumer durables, even when the offer of, quote, easy payment lured them into debt. Moreover, the basis of the world boom was extremely fragile, resting as it did on the continued flow of U.S. capital to Europe to finance Europe's trade deficit with the United States. As U.S. investment extended the U.S. boom to Europe, rising European imports intensified the boom in the U.S. As the mood of optimism spread to Wall Street, the boom entered its speculative phase and capital flooded back from Europe, putting the international financial system under severe pressure, which it was nevertheless able to withstand. However, as the increased capacity created in the boom came into production, it came up against the barrier of the limited market. While productive capitalists were able to finance growing stocks and trading losses on credit, the speculative boom on Wall Street could persist. But once the chain of credit began to break down, the bubble had to burst. The gold standard had been remarkably successful in sustaining the boom despite the acute geographical and sectoral unevenness of accumulation, the severity of the crash being testimony to the extent to which international capital movements and the cooperation between New York and London had been able to accommodate the pressures. The international financial system offered a means of suspending the barriers to accumulation by providing credit. But the international financial system did not provide any means of overcoming those barriers to accumulation. Moreover, while accumulation could be sustained on the basis of the expansion of credit, bankers were under considerable political pressure to maintain low interest rates and easy credit to avoid checking the boom, and New York kept interest rates down to support London and so maintain the gold standard. While in retrospect, it is clear that credit was overextended. At the time, the bankers were only sharing the optimistic mood of the capitalist class as a whole. Had the barrier of the limited market and the uneven development of accumulation been overcome, the bankers would have been applauded for their wisdom and their faith. It was ultimately the failure of capital to overcome these barriers that progressively increased the pressure on the international financial system. The collapse of the financial system, first in the United States, then on a world scale, led to a massive contraction of credit that brought accumulation back within the limits of the market. But the bankers were not responsible for the extent of the crash. Once the chain of credit had broken down, the priority was to restore the stability of the monetary system as the essential precondition for the resumption of accumulation and the renewed expansion of credit. Bankers may have been unduly cautious in the Depression, as bankers may have been unduly liberal in the boom. But again, the bankers' caution was bred of the pessimism the bankers shared with the whole of the capitalist class. The weakness of the gold standard appeared to lie in the shortage of international liquidity that arose from the limited supplies and uneven distribution of the world's gold reserves and the increasingly multilateral and decentralized network of international payments. However, the system was very successful in its short life in supplementing supplies of gold with supplies of convertible currency, so that there was far more international liquidity available than there had been before the war, both in public and in private hands. The underlying problem was not the shortage of liquidity, but the extent of the geographical and sectoral unevenness of accumulation that the financial system was called upon to accommodate. Acute trade imbalances were covered by international capital movements as the surplus capital created by the expansion of credit sought profitable outlets around the world. However, the reliance on such movements meant that the system would inevitably come under pressure, however much liquidity was available. As the crisis of overaccumulation struck and capital was diverted into increasingly speculative ventures. The crisis was only warded off by the continued expansion of credit, which fueled inflation and speculation on a world scale, as capital failed to overcome the barriers to accumulation. Once the crisis broke, financial reconstruction could only proceed once the basis of sound credit had been restored by bringing accumulation back within the limits of the market. The expansion of credit in the boom had intensified the global overaccumulation and uneven development of capital. With the massive contraction of domestic and international credit in the crash, stability could only be restored by the familiar means of the devaluation of capital and the destruction of productive capacity on an enormous scale. As in previous crises, however, the nation state could not simply stand aside and permit the sacrifice of domestic production and employment on the altar of gold. The crisis initially appeared to the nation state in the form of a drain on the reserves and a weakening of the currency. However, the adoption of deflationary policies to check speculation against the currency and to restore the balance of international payments led to the contraction of domestic production and employment, a budget deficit as tax revenues fell while expenditure, particularly on unemployment relief, rose, and growing political unrest. The attempt to meet the budget deficit by borrowing would stimulate the domestic economy, but at the risk of provoking further speculation around the currency. On the other hand, cuts in public expenditure and increased taxation would intensify the depression and sharpen the class struggle. The suspension of gold convertibility, devaluation of the currency, and introduction of protective tariffs provided the means by which the nation state could relieve the pressure on the currency by contracting imports and stemming the flight of capital, and so reduce the immediate domestic impact of the crisis. However, the adoption of such policies on a world scale led to a further contraction of international credit and decline in world trade, which only intensified the depression. Thus, domestic stabilization policies can only succeed if complemented by the reconstruction of the system of international trade and payments. In the wake of the crisis of 1873, Britain's commitment to free trade and the strength of sterling had confined protectionism within limits and had permitted the recovery of accumulation on a world scale on the basis of a substantial growth of international credit. However, the global character of the crisis of the 1930s meant that no national government could afford to make the sacrifices or take the political risks of further restraining domestic accumulation to make its currency sufficiently strong to serve as the basis for the reconstruction of the international monetary system. The only way in which the reconstruction of international trade and finance could succeed was through bilateral negotiations on the basis of complementary trading and investment patterns reinforced by the state's regulation of the international movement of commodities, money, and capital within discrete financial blocks. Where such complementarity could not be achieved by mutual agreement between nation states, it was achieved by the exercise of the financial, commercial, political, and ultimately military power of the dominant nation states, creating the international tensions between the blocs that culminated in war. With the collapse of the gold standard and the use of protection and exchange controls to maintain the balance of payments, domestic monetary policies were freed from international constraint. However, policies of cheap money were not sufficient to secure recovery. While world trade remained severely depressed, excess capacity persisted in the staple industries, and the growth of new industries was limited by the relative stagnation of the domestic market. The failure of the market to achieve the appropriate restructuring of capital and the failure of easy monetary policies to secure renewed accumulation raised the question of more active state intervention in the regulation of accumulation and through increasing doubt on the liberal orthodoxies. In Germany, the Nazis destroyed the organized strength of the working class and constructed a corporate state which dissolved the distinction between the money power of capital and capital's political power, as it fused civil society and the state to install a totalitarian state capitalism. In the Soviet Union, the crisis consolidated the grip of Stalin and confirmed the move towards a totalitarian state socialism. Meanwhile, the liberal bourgeoisie sought a middle way between the two extremes. Liberalism rose to the challenge with the, quote, Keynesian revolution.